Hello everyone. I think we'll just go ahead and get started. We might have a few people joining a little late, but that's totally fine. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again for the slideshow. Awesome. Cool. And thanks so much for joining us for this second of our series of 3 virtual teach-ins. We're the Oregon Student Association, and I'm super stoked today because we have someone joining us from Partners for a Hunger-Free Oregon. So we're going to be co-presenting this teach-in together. Should go over some pretty good information and then also have time at the end for a good Q&A and just discussion about some of these issues and ways we can be advocating on making the situation better for everyone, right? So if you don't know who I am, I'm Andrew. I'm the Executive Director of Oregon Student Association, and I use he, him, his pronouns. And Venus, I'll let you introduce yourself too.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And just a disclaimer, put in the chat or let me know if the outside becomes too noisy because someone just decided to mow their lawn. So sorry, but it's so nice out. Like Andrew said, my name's Venus Barnes, and I use she, her, hers, and I work for Partners for Hunger-Free Oregon. I focus mainly on college hunger, so students who are food insecure, but I also help conduct a community advocacy group for our SNAP advisory board, and they talk directly to DHS to help change policy. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us, Venus. Yeah, so we did our first teach-in last week. I see a few familiar faces or names and icons from that first one. It was Why is Education a Privilege, Not a Right? And we talked about a few things, kind of the achievement gap, especially for students of color and other underrepresented students. We talked about the kind of the history in Oregon of state divestment in higher ed and how that impacted tuition. We also talked a little bit about kind of the move towards a private-public partnership model for specifically our universities and kind of how anti-tax movements in Oregon in the last few decades have really put the state in a situation of not having enough money to invest in higher ed. So with this one, we're hoping to kind of go from that point and then go a bit deeper into other issues impacting us, right? So this is called A Crisis from Before the Pandemic, the Rising Cost of Textbooks, Food, and Housing. And the goals of our teach-in today are to discuss a few things. So first of all, student food and housing insecurity. Second, the gaps between student financial need and available financial aid. The textbook industry and open educational resource programs, and then what's next for Oregon, and have a little chat about what we've been doing recently to work on policies to alleviate the situation, as well as what's next and what's the best place to go from here.
Yeah, so just to go right into it, our college hunger food insecurity is quite real. In the last 30 days, just to indicate, we have had 41% of our students indicate that they are food insecure. And this is done by a survey with the Hope Center. And as we dig a little deeper, we'll also start learning more about some of these intersections and how they play out, like Andrew had mentioned, and how they overlap and become compound issues. So food here is just one indicator of how students are struggling in order to access higher ed. So depending on a student's situation, that includes housing. And so right here, 52% of our college students right here in Oregon are experiencing or indicating that they are housing insecure. This is similar to the previous slide, that these are just going to acerbate as we continue with this crisis at hand. So these are numbers that were created or have been indicated before this pandemic. So you could just imagine how these numbers are at jeopardy to go up. Go ahead, And then also homelessness for our college students, it's 20% in this last year that college students it indicated that they were homeless or houseless. And this again is just another increasing, scope that we need to continue to fight for and look at for our students. Yep.
Thanks so much for that, Venus. And I did see a question in the chat of how many folks were surveyed in this. And Venus, I know you did send me that PDF, so I can send it out actually, so everyone who attends this will get a copy of that study. But do you know off the top of your head, Venus, or is there any other details of that survey you would want to highlight?
I do. I believe it was around 8,000 in the state of Oregon, but I have it right here. Let me look real quick.
Cool.
It was 8,100 students. 14 were community college students out of that number. 14 community colleges responded to the Real College Survey, sorry. So 14 colleges, community colleges, out of that number, there were 8,100 students who participated. And like Andrew said, he has a link to this document, so he'll go ahead and either put that in the chat or send that out.
Definitely, yeah. I'll go ahead and send that out to everyone after this so that you can review it on your own, because it's really important information to know. So thanks for sharing that, Venus, and thanks for the question. So with that overview, I think that it's important for us to really start thinking about these needs and how they're impacting each other, right? So I think it's really important to think about the total cost of education, right? And that's not just tuition and fees, right? That's also textbooks, that's housing, that's food security, that's food access, that's childcare. And so something that's really been happening is, as the cost of all these things has gone up, the actual support available, especially for low-income students, hasn't really kept pace with it. So this chart right here we're looking at, it compares over the last decade or decade plus, different snapshots of different times in history. And we're seeing at any institution, regardless of its public 4-year, private 4-year, public 2-year, private for-profit institution, what we're seeing is that the total amount of Pell Grant that you're able to get is really hovering at only covering about 20 to 30%, or in some cases even less, of the actual total price of attending, right? So what we're seeing is this issue of food and housing insecurity getting worse because even when someone qualifies for financial aid, that financial aid isn't even really fully covering the cost of everything they need, right? To fully illustrate that point further, this slide might look familiar if you were in the first teach-in. If we just zoom in and look at one of our campuses here in Oregon, Lane Community College, this is a comparison of how the situation has kind of gotten worse, right? So this is looking at the federal Pell Grant program as well as the Oregon Opportunity Grant program. And what we're seeing is 2014 to 2015, the full Pell and Oregon Opportunity Grant was enough to cover beyond just the cost of tuition. What that meant was it was a lot easier for us to be also paying tuition, but also paying for these other expenses, right? Food, transportation, housing, childcare, books. But in this most recent year, what we've seen is even the cost of attendance is not fully covered by the full Pell Grant and the Oregon Opportunity Grant, right? And to make matters even a little worse, highlighting just some outcomes from the most recent report from the HEC, the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, around the Oregon Opportunity Grant. Our Oregon Opportunity Grant program, which is a state-funded need-based aid program here in Oregon. I know I really depended on the Oregon Opportunity Grant to go to school and be able to afford it. Is severely underfunded to the fact that year after year we're seeing way more Oregonians in need who would qualify for the program and are simply not getting it just because the state doesn't have enough money to go around. So this graph we're seeing here is just another comparison of that. It's from the HEC, their most recent report on the Oregon Opportunity Grant. And we're seeing that there's still so many students who qualify for the Oregon Opportunity Grant, but don't actually receive it. So next we're gonna hone in on kind of another key component here, and that's textbook prices. So this is a quote from an article by Emma Whitford in Inside Higher Ed in 2018. And it's actually a report that summarized a study that was done by Cengage, which is actually a textbook company that we're going to be talking about a little bit more in a second here. But if we could all just kind of take a sec to read this quote that we have on the slide here, and this summary of what they found when they were looking at what kind of burdens the cost of textbooks was putting on students. And I'll give us all a sec to read through it and think about it, and then we'll keep going. It would help if I didn't change the slide. All right, so what we're seeing is textbooks are really a serious thing for students, right? I can't highlight enough how frequently I and my work hear from students about paying hundreds of dollars for textbooks a term, being unable to sell those textbooks back, and things like this, right? Foregoing trips home to see family, skipping meals, taking less classes, so actually having your education disrupted, needing to work jobs, pick up more hours, all to save money for books, right? So the textbook industry is an industry. It's a profitable industry, right? And we know from a report that came out in Business Insider, which I will also send out the link and kind of the supplementary materials at the end of this, that nearly 80% of the textbook industry is run by these 5 companies that we show here. The name of that article is actually right here on this slide as well. But the report goes in depth about kind of the way that these companies make sure that it's a profitable business for them, right? And that includes things like changing up editions and doing new updated editions. And actually they started making sure to switch up editions like every 2 years instead of every 4 years, because they heard about too many students saving money by like reselling books and stuff. They would make editions way more different on purpose so that if you tried to get an older edition, it would just be really impossible to follow along with your coursework. And they would change up how they would be bundling different products together. So a lot of really illuminating items in this article, which I will once again share out to really understand that this kind of runaway cost of textbooks is definitely something that's being driven by the desire to make money by these companies, right? And once again, if we look, this slide right here just shows the kinds of salaries or total compensation in a year that some of these top executives at these companies are making, right? So we have $1.86 million made by the top executive at Pearson in 2019, 3.3 million made in total compensation for the chairman of the board, president, and CEO of Scholastic. In 2012, 3.19 million was made as total compensation by the CEO of McGraw-Hill. So we're seeing that there's some people that are definitely really benefiting from these practices that are really putting such a strain on all of us.
This is me, yes. Yeah, so then the cerveza sickness hit us. And so now we have students experiencing layoffs, meaning yeah, means housing and food access is even tougher for students. Some restrictions have been temporarily loosened for the help for students, and the state is anticipating less tax revenue, and therefore they'll be looking at more cuts, and usually higher ed and social safety nets are the first thing that go on the chopping block. And the federal relief barriers, the stimulus checks, not only to many college students, are not going to many college students. There are also students that will be taxed on the CARES Act funding. Plus, many students don't even qualify for the CARES Act funding, especially non-Pell eligible, non-Pell eligible, undocumented students, international students, DACA students. And these students also are not able to qualify for a lot of the state programs like SNAP or TANF and things like that for relief. So this just compacts those issues for our students who normally get left behind. They're usually left on the fringes.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that, Venus. So this is something that's huge, and this is something we've been working on a lot as OSA, right? I mean, especially in terms of CARES Act funding, a lot of student governments have been really trying to push to be mindful with institutions of how that money is going out to support students. And there's different institutions at different places, but something we've really seen is that because our undocumented, undocuplus, and international students don't qualify for that CARES Act funding, institutions needing to really find more creative ways to be able to support those students, right? So for instance, at Western Oregon University, their student leaders and student government really pushed their administration to focus on private fundraising through their foundation, so that they could make alternative sources of money available for relief for students that don't qualify for CARES Act funding. And that's something that we in OSA Spaces have been talking about a lot, so that other campuses can look at adopting that model and spreading that. And I did see that there was a question in the chat about if one of those textbook companies we had mentioned also bought another company to do an online college program using their own materials. That's a good question. I don't actually know about that story. So I don't have the info on that, but it definitely would not surprise me by any means.
And Andrew, just real quickly, there was also someone in the comments that made a comment about how some students are eligible and still are being denied. And that's going to be a common theme for students to have to advocate for themselves. So just because you're told no, go right back and clarify that, because it's a bit of an adjustment with all these new rules.
Right. Yeah, thanks for highlighting that, Venus. That's a really good point. All right, so we've kind of gone through a lot of the bad news, which is really not news to us, right? But we've kind of gone over the bad things happening, and now we kind of want to shift gears and talk about what is proactive that can be getting done, and some of the things we've been working on recently, and some of the things that we can talk about really focusing on moving forward. So kind of perfect timing with that. Some of the things I'm seeing popping up in the chat are about how it's important for students to advocate for their needs, right? And I'm seeing someone say, I don't recall one, but a company that do an online college or education programs, and that they'll follow up, and that even considering this, those are even eligible, have denied. So that's what Venus highlighted. So thanks for that. So Open Educational Resources is a program that was started within the last few years. It's actually kind of part of a nationwide movement. And here in Oregon, we just renewed funding for it successfully. We were working on expanding funding for it, but we did renew funding for it. Open Educational Resources are essentially open source materials, so they're free or low cost, oftentimes digital textbook alternatives. So the idea is to really gear classrooms and how they're set up with their learning materials so that the materials that students are accessing aren't as expensive as some of these big textbook companies that we just talked about, right? And so I do have a link that I can send out as well that kind of shows the savings that have occurred for students at the institutions that have gone pretty far with implementing them. And it really depends on which institution you're at, how much your institution has implemented open educational resources. There are definitely some community colleges and universities that have kind of gotten ahead in terms of how much saving students are finding. And there's some that have kind of lagged behind in implementing them. So I think it's a really good thing to know and to be looking through once I send that information out and think about your campus and how much are you encountering open educational resources on your campus. And I think it really does depend not only on the campus, but the department, right? But at the end of the day, this is a big state-funded program. The OSA has partnered with this program a lot since its beginning and since the very first advocacy was happening to get it funded. And we really do want to keep pushing to not only expand state funding for this program, but also to support students in expanding implementation of this program on their campuses. Another item with regards to textbook affordability is 2213. That was legislation that we passed in 2019. So the textbook affordability plan, what it does was it required each public community college and university to establish a textbook affordability plan and include students in the planning process. So this is another bill that was a big win, right? And we're not done with it because anytime we pass a bill, whether it was, cultural competency plans on our campuses, which we passed in 2017, or this one, or the Open Educational Resource Program, right? It's one thing to get a program created. It's another thing to make sure that our institutions are actually implementing that and that students are really pushing to be included in that the way they need to. So that's really another really good bill to know about, and it was a small win, but there's still some unfinished business from that one too, right? So there was a big item left out that we had originally had in the bill. It was a provision requiring that faculty report their course materials adoption in time for students to have pricing information when registration opens for the next term. And that's really important because it's pretty helpful to actually know the total cost of the class that you're registering for before registering for it, right? Especially when you're trying to manage your timeline, chart out, all these different prerequisites and required classes. That becomes even more difficult than it already is when you don't actually know whether you can actually afford the materials for a class. So that's one that we really think is important, and there's kind of an ongoing working group going on with that one. But we've really had trouble getting that provision passed so far because of objections from the College Bookstore Association, as well as from a lot of faculty unions. So the College Bookstore Association is kind of worried about hindrances to their timeline of like supply chains and like the timeline on which they're doing orders and processing them. And then the faculty unions who express concern have been mostly expressing concern about the idea of academic freedom. And then Venus, I'll let you talk about another bill we've been working on.
Yeah, so HB 4055 was a food and housing security bill. So this bill would require the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, the HEC, to conduct a study to provide an in-depth understanding of the prevalence of food and housing insecurity across all Oregon public universities and community colleges. And the report would be reported back to legislator in the long-term policy and budgetary proposal. So the status of this bill right now is passage impeded by 2020 from the Republican walkout. In general, what that means is because the Republicans walked out, the bill was not able to be attended to, so it wasn't able to move forward. Did you want me to talk a little bit about what I'm want to work on now?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, it's such a strange thing. It was such a good idea to set us up well for going
Yep.
into the long session, but we don't have that now, right? So now it's like, what are we doing next? So absolutely love to hear
Yeah.
about it.
So, we're resilient. So we are working, well, I'm working on college hunger for our college campuses. And that is really just looking at how colleges can be hunger free. And so we are moving into a bill for the long session by providing student voices. So what I did what term was that? Winter term. I did 7 listening circles. And so those were in person, and we asked several different questions around the student experience. And these are all the intersections, kind of like we've gone over, or Andrew had mentioned, of like childcare, transportation, things like that. So it's not just food, right? The food is just one of the avenues of to talk about some of these impacts. But we also sent out a survey to several different colleges that weren't able to participate in person. But the ones that were able to participate, we had 3 universities. That would be PSU, University of Oregon, and Western University. And then we had 4 community colleges, and those were Clackamas Community College, PCC, Cascade, Lane Community College, and Lynn Benton. And so a number of those participants were able to share out, and we are taking that data this spring term, making an analysis, coming up with some themes, and then hopefully in the summer we will bring this back to folks like yourselves, the community colleges that we had in-person listening circles with, and just really talk about, like, are these some of the themes that you were thinking that would be in a bill, and taking that time to adjust, and then the fall actually having a bill crafted that we could introduce in the long session. So if anyone's interested in participating in that, that's my pitch. And there's also other opportunities to work with me about, like, changing the narrative around, like, SNAP or what a college student is. That's a longer term, but working with the communication agency for how you tell your story. So that's my other pitch.
Awesome. Yeah, that's all really exciting and great work, Venus. So thanks so much for talking about that. And I'm actually pulling up your info right now so I can throw it in the chat so that folks know this is definitely something that OSA and partners are going to be partnering on a lot. So definitely we're a good contact for this, but also this opportunity to work with Venus directly is really cool. So I'm throwing that in here too, because it never helps to have more folks working on these important issues. And so I was kind of also just wondering, Venus, is there any other kind of key findings or themes that you would pull out from the listening circles, or kind of thoughts that you took away from that?
Yeah, I can tell you, from my own experience of being in all the listening circles, and what I noticed what I noticed that kept coming up were things around number one, housing. The housing price for students is just astronomical. I mean, even students that are able to, like, live in dorms, that just really not even be able to afford that. And then it was books. So it was like, between housing and books, students really struggled to maintain stable ground. And then it would be all the other bills. Students would talk about whether it be transportation, like having a bill every month of trying to take the bus or gas, or childcare. So these are all, like, things that come repeatedly month to month. And then food, it was a big issue. It's just one of those bills that gets a lot of play. Like, it's the only monthly bill that you get to have all autonomy. Like, I get to choose to starve. I mean, no one's telling you that you have to have a certain amount of money to be responsible to eat. And really that's systematic, right? So all of those intersections did come up. And then we also spent a little time of like, if you pie in the sky had an option, what would your school look like? So a lot of interesting things were coming up for students. Some as low as the bar of having granola bars in the classroom to college should be free, so it was quite the range.
Wonderful. Yeah, well, thanks so much for that kind of summary. And once again, thanks for that work. It was really awesome to have that happening. And I know that I'm really excited to keep working with partners on figuring out like the best approach moving forward towards the 2020 session to start tackling some of this big issue, right? I was also wondering and kind of hoping to just open up to everyone in here, like what kind of like food insecurity and housing insecurity initiatives have you all been a part of on your campus, or have you just seen on your campus? Like what kind of work is being done by you all as students, or just by student groups and leaders, or even your institutions to kind of address some of this stuff? You can raise your hand or you can throw it in the chat. See two hands, so I'm gonna unmute Nick first because I think I saw Nick's hand go up first.
Hey everyone, my name's Nick. My pronouns are he, him, his. I was a student at LCC and now I'm currently a student at UO. Some things at LCC that there was for food insecurity, I think the biggest thing was the rainy day food pantry, which was an on-campus food pantry that was started with a partnership with Food for Lane County. And that was a really popular resource. It still is. It got like a lot of daily traffic, and it just recently got moved to a new location where it was not refurbished, but like remodeled. So that's been going well. And then at UO, I believe there is a food pantry as well. It's not as available as the LCC one. It's located in a church, and it's like only open a few days a week for a few hours. But there at least is an option sometime. And then other things are just like there's like a food insecurity task force that works a lot with like the sustainability. I don't know what it's called, like a department, or it's something in the email. And then there's also like programs like leftover text over, when there's like leftover food on campus. We have a system where you can like text into the system and let people know that there's food, and it will text out to every student that's signed up, and they'll have like 10 minutes, they'll have like 15 to 20 minutes to get to that building, and they can take as much of the food as they want. So there's some pretty cool initiatives going on at both of those schools, but always like more to do. And so I'm curious to hear what others have to say as well. Thank you.
Totally. Yeah, that's all really good to hear about. Thanks, Nick. And then Madeline.
Yeah, I know at PSU we have kind of like some of the usual programs as far as like food pantry, which our food pantry is doing really great work right now as far as like also offering delivery to those who might have increased need. They're also partnering with our student services with children on campus, which is pretty cool, as far as providing like diapers and other materials for student parents, which I think is pretty neat. There's also this grant funded program. I'm not remembering the name of it right now and I can't find the email, but I know we had them come in and kind of talk at our last Senate meeting. Maybe E remembers their name, but it was someone who came in and he talked about this program where they're also trying to partner kind of SNAP and those benefits, matching people with career resources and kind of academic success kind of resources in the line with that. So yeah, I think there's kind of some cool things in the pipeline, but there's also obviously a long way to go too.
Totally. Yeah, thanks for sharing, both of you. Anything else? Anyone else would share? I see E's hand up, so I'll unmute E, I think.
Yeah. Hi. One thing that I noticed really, it's not a resource, it's actually a real challenge that I saw was that with the CARES Fund, our university put a limit on how much they would put towards food. So if you listed food as one of your needs, the most they would give you was $500. And so I thought that was interesting that like, no matter how much your need was, the max for it was $500 specifically for food. There wasn't limits on other things. So I just thought, is that unique to PSU? Is that a CARES Fund regulation? Or I'm curious if you all had any more thoughts about that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's good to know. I had not actually heard that, E. So the CARES Act, and I can also, for folks who aren't super familiar, I can send out the text of the CARES Act as well in my, what will now be a very long list of follow-up materials. The CARES Act regulations were pretty vague. In fact, we knew about the CARES Act funding coming out. At this point, I think a month or 6 weeks ago, Gabby, correct me if I'm wrong, but like there was just this time where everything was going wild, that everyone was realizing what a big crisis COVID was. And I just remember being on the phone with the HEC and the institutions and everyone, like all these decision makers, and like asking all these questions. And they're like, yeah, we don't know, we're figuring this out as we go. The CARES Act, like really the only like big things we know in terms of the CARES Act that it said in terms of how institutions could spend the money was 50% of the money had to go to student aid, and that they had to be Pell eligible students, which of course excludes a lot of students, right? But in terms of limiting on food, to my knowledge, there's nothing in there. Yeah, Venus is shaking her head like, nope. So
Yeah,
I
I
asked
was
her.
gonna say, I have not heard of that.
Yeah.
Go
So, and I
back.
also have not heard of that happening at other institutions. Have you, Venus?
I have not. Yeah, I would question it. Like, what is up with that?
Yeah, and what was interesting is they didn't tell you when you apply. They only told you after you were either approved or denied, and that was like one of the things that they would say.
Yeah, that's really good to know. And that's gross. I would question that too. I don't like that at all. And I mean, I've definitely heard different complaints from different like students at different institutions about things that their administrations are deciding about that aren't perfect, right? Like I know at U of O, there's like this like push like, oh, like exhaust all your resources, like apply for this funding after you've taken out loans. And it's like, what are you doing? Like, do you get what's going on? So yeah, definitely like not a unique moment of an institution not being as great as we would wish they would be with how they distribute it. So that's good to know about, Ian. We'd love to talk more about that too. Any other like thoughts or highlights from folks? Cool. Well, I've just got a few more slides to go over then, and then we can get kind of back into conversation or question and answer mode. But just some relevant programs that I think it's important for us to just kind of like have in our minds. And there's definitely like, this is not an exhaustive list, so people feel free to like say more, but federally funded programs would be federal Pell Grant, right? That's like a need-based financial aid grant. We didn't list federal loans here because we don't like loans as much for a myriad of reasons, and that could fill up an entire teach-in on its own. And even federal loan servicing, like it's not really completely just the government. There's also for-profit companies involved in that stuff, right? But so we'll just keep it with federal Pell Grant, right? And then the SNAP program. And then federal work study. Like one big thing that was a big concern for students was so many students during COVID were going to be getting laid off. And there was a lot of talk about like, what about federal work study? That was like one of our first questions we came to as a like as a coalition in OSA, and basically the institutions did get clarification that even if a student who had an on-campus federal work-study job like couldn't work because of COVID, they could still get funding. And Venus, I know that's something that you had also worked on. Did you have any kind of like background or info to add on that?
Well, yeah, just to reiterate that if you had work study and you were working on the college campus and you're like, it's closed, I don't really know what to do, you still have access to that funding. And a lot of my students actually qualified for SNAP for the first time. So they were really worried about, oh no, now I can't meet my hours, I'm not doing work study. And you're completely exempt from the work requirements. So just to tie those work study and SNAP together, students are still able to access that. And if they can't access that because someone's telling them that, use my phone number there to call me.
Awesome, thanks, Venus. Yeah, and then in terms of state-funded programs, we talked a bit about the Oregon Opportunity Grant. I know that, once again, like this is such an important grant for so many students in Oregon. And it's also one, we've talked about this in the last teach-in too, that higher ed programs really get put on the chopping block a lot in this state, especially because the state has so many things it needs to fund and such limited revenue due to a decades-long push to dismantle systems by which Oregon could raise tax revenue, which we go into in Teach-In 1. So if you missed that and want the video, let me know and I'll send it your way. And I remember the first thing that I got involved with as a student like 10 years ago with OSA was Oregon Opportunity Grant was on the chopping block, and I had literally just gotten like settled in. I was like 2 terms into school and I was like, am I going to be able to come back to school? Who knows? So that's something we have to push for and fight for a lot. And once again, like in past years, 2/3 of those who qualify for the grant didn't get it just because of underfunding, right? So there's so much more to do with that. Open educational resource programs, as we mentioned, the Oregon Promise program is a program specifically to help students attend 2-year colleges. And so that's definitely a relevant one. One issue with it, OSA is trying to like start talking more and looking into how financial aid programs are set up. There's this concept of first dollar in versus last dollar in financial aid programs. And basically the Oregon Promise is a last dollar in program, which means that it takes into account when deciding how much money you get from this program, how much money you're getting from other need-based aid, which actually like the outcome of that is oftentimes higher income students are accessing this money, and lower income students who have other need-based aid because they qualify for it based on their level of need have a hard time getting enough money from that program to like actually like do the whole thing where they're covering their tuition as well as their basic needs of living, like food and housing security, right? So first dollar in programs are kind of set up in a different way that's a bit better for that, and there's more flexibility for students and they don't get dinged for things, and it's easier to then cover all their bases with financial aid. So that's something that there's been interest brought up by students and by state decision makers around looking at like, does it make sense to have this be a last dollar in program? So I would just highlight that. And then once again, SNAP, like there is a state, like the state does pay some of the administrative cost for SNAP. And also like they do, I think like Venus, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they do sometimes infuse more state money into SNAP, like during COVID-19, they gave more funding towards SNAP, right?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So that we have 2 streams of funding. One is called Pandemic SNAP, which is more geared towards participants who have families. So not to say that students don't have families, but that's one stream of funding. The other stream of funding is called Emergency SNAP, and that actually means if you were getting SNAP and you were only getting like $10, for whatever reasons, the gods have decided, right now for April, May, is it March? No, April, May, and June, you can receive the full amount of that benefit. So I don't know if students here or if you heard, I normally only get $10 and now I got 109 or something, you know. That's really weird. It's because that's the emergency funding that has tried to make up for the cerveza sickness that we're in. And they've extended it to June, and then the DHS will reevaluate that stream of funding at that time. The pandemic SNAP is for families who have children who are receiving free and reduced lunch. And there's nothing you need to do. So if my child is on free and reduced lunch, I get an additional, for each month, it's a different amount as well. For each month, I get an additional, I think it's like between 60 and 100, and then it goes back down to 60. I'm not sure why, but you get these additional funding for that time. And it's just based off of our summer meals program. So it's the same type of model, but they sort of pushed it to this time because we're in the cerveza sickness and children are not in school. So you can receive both. So you can receive the additional money for the pandemic SNAP for your children, and you will receive the full amount for these coming months that we're in. Does that
That's
make
really good
sense?
info.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you go on my website, it's there as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And once again, that all that contact info on that website is in the chat and will be in the email too. Cool. So just summing it up, right? Like, I think it's really important to realize all of these costs are connected. We need to like look at the way total cost of attendance is impacted by all these different factors. And another thing to realize is there's a huge gap between need and aid, right? And so really pushing for there to be more financial aid programs for students and more accessible financial aid programs, and also make sure that those programs are set up in a way that it fully covers all of their needs when we're talking about these issues of total cost of attendance, right? And this was a crisis already, as the title is, right? This was a crisis before this pandemic. And what we're seeing now is COVID-19 has made things worse, right? But another thing that I think should be on our radar, especially when we're thinking about organizing and activism and advocacy, is states are now looking at the reopening process. And something that is a big concern of mine, and Venus, I think we talked about this being a concern of ours when we were kind of prepping this, is the state has maybe done some things to make it so students can access unemployment insurance or SNAP easier. And that's great, even though now it's like hard to even apply because of the wait, because everyone's applying. But now is the state just gonna reopen the economy and then rip these things away from students when like it shouldn't have taken a global pandemic to make it so that students can access SNAP maybe when they're working 20 hours a week? Like, so I think that we need to realize that it's not just about being vigilant about what's happened as COVID-19 has hit, but also in the reopening stage, because we also know that the state is going to be looking to make budget cuts, right? So the state is anticipating and getting less tax revenue because of the economic downturn from COVID-19. They're going to be looking at cutting programs, and we need to be fighting to expand these programs. But also we're really going to be fighting to defend these programs. So that's kind of how I would sum it up, and think it's important to kind of keep that in mind moving forward. Venus, would you add anything to that?
I think you summed it up nicely, and just all of us moving forward, like when we're on these webinars or we're in the act of activism, we also need to remember to be kind to ourselves. I also remind our students, you know, who are struggling through class on this new way of learning, first and foremost, to be kind to yourself. So that's the only thing I would really add.
Totally.
So we're in this together. I mean, this is new.
Absolutely, yeah. Very true. Thanks so much for that, Venus. Great. And with that, that's kind of all of the main info we have to throw at you all. And with the rest of the time, you know, we had said this was going to go till about 5:30. So if we go that long, great. And if we wrap up a bit earlier, cool. But we'd really just love to open the floor up to just Q&A. If folks have any questions for Venus or for me or for each other, or just really any discussion that folks want to have about kind of this issue. I see.
I'd just like to say something. Hi, Melanie. This is Melanie here. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to have the OER. I've had an opportunity to have these resources, and they really do actually help save quite a bit of money. And it's just a wonderful resource to have. So I really appreciate having that. And I don't really have a whole lot of questions today, but I do, as an intern with the Oregon Student Association, I am really finding these webinars very informative, and I really like to keep up on the House bills, and I'm hoping that the food and housing security bill, so that will be going through the 2020 session, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right, well, I just wanted to say how I appreciate all of the hard work that has been done prior, and how great it is to be able to join together and talk about these things. So thank you for having me today. I'm going to have to leave at 5, but I really appreciate everybody's time.
Great. Thanks so much for joining, Melanie.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thanks.
And get a hold of me. Okay.
And E, I see your hand up too, so I'll go ahead and unmute you.
I just got to get a light on. I'm curious, maybe this is a twofold question. One, I'm curious, this like when you talked about opening up, Andrew, what really comes up for me is that the things that are opening first are going to be low-wage jobs, retail, food, these places where like communities of color tend to be in, where the kind of jobs we're able to get. And it seems almost to be a kind of an experiment of like, we're going to try it out on the communities that have the least access to things like healthcare or, I don't know, clean space, whatever. And so I'm just feeling like what more can I be doing to advocate for these programs to continue, for folks to, I don't know, are there things that the Oregon Student Association is doing to specifically advocate at the legislator level, at the governor's level, and what can students outside of OSA or even just in our schools be doing to advocate for those same things moving forward? I mean, PSU hasn't made a decision on fall, but I imagine it's going to be online again. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good question. So I'd say a few things. So first, I'll start kind of on campus level. I do think it's important that students are really talking about whether they're comfortable with their spaces reopening, both students and workers, because what we've seen is a lot of reopening plans on campuses. We keep hearing that they're not involving students. We haven't been that proactively involved as an organization as we would have liked, and also our labor unions, right? And so I definitely agree that kind of, the first places reopening, to use the term experiment, and especially with the most vulnerable, low income, and like people of color, like I think that that's a very real concern. And I think that thinking about our campus spaces reopening safely for all stakeholders and really advocating for that, that's one big thing that needs to happen. Because I myself am also thinking about, not only like students and faculty and staff at our different institutions, but also as our different institutions are opening, then, as someone who manages a staff who's there to serve these students, like I'm starting to think like, what does that mean for our organization and our values too, right? So I'm kind of right there with you about the worry about reopening spaces. And I think really advocating for students to be heard and workers to be heard by administrations is huge. As to the government, so I'll be kind of very frank about What I see happening at a statewide level is I think that the state of Oregon has not given a lot of clear signals as to whether they're going to be like when they're going to be meeting or having sessions. Like there was talk about a special session happening. It hasn't happened. I don't think that anyone wants the political ownership of the kind of cuts that leaders in the state think is necessary. So we're just kind of trying to watch that. I mean, there's definitely hearings that are happening. There's going to be a hearing that happens in the education committee next week, but they've really limited it to like sometimes they do like open hearings and sometimes it's like invited testimony only. So they like limited it to like one community college student, one university student, and one faculty employee, and like all of this stuff. But like really talking to the HEC, and we've kind of shared out with the HEC like our concerns about these things and are trying to get them. So there is like kind of little ways that we can do, but the big thing that this is going towards is what's going to happen in a session. And it seems like it's kind of playing the waiting game in terms of the session. And then I think the third component of that is federal advocacy. We have kind of kept with federal advocacy. It's kind of rough because in Oregon, like a lot of our asks that we were bringing, like were asks that were very much being championed by our representatives to the United States Congress, and they're just not in the majority, right? So I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but that's the biggest things I would highlight.
Yeah, I mean, just keep us engaged, keep letting us know how we can kind of advocate on our I think summer is harder for us, but I still want to keep hearing what can we be doing to advocate more, including capturing stories, like Madeline's saying, sending in, you know, our own comments, like whatever we can do to support this work at a large level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I guess I would only add, because I was raised by Black Panthers, is get in, like, protest, like organize. And I know this is being recorded, but yeah, I would, social media right now, because it's legal, I would organize in a way like that they're not ready for. Oh, you say Fred Meyer's is open? No, we're closed. I'm not showing up to work, and organizing that way. I'm so glad you brought that up, E, because that is exactly what it is. It is a test experiment. It's a temperature check before winter hits of the real pandemic, you know? And that's really all we have. No one is going to save us in that sense. So organizing on a community level, I guess I could say that because I work at Partners.
Yeah, thanks for that. Totally. Let's see. I think I see Nick's hand up, and then Madeline, I'll get to you.
I think Madeline was first. If you want to go first, Madeline.
Oh, my bad. Okay, yeah, Madeline, what's up?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, kind of like adding to the thing that I linked in the chat, like my friends who still work at Fred Meyer, I quit over the summer due to a lot of issues with them. But that's a story for another day. But they basically have had to reapply constantly for hazard pay every 30 days. And then now apparently they're eliminating it for a one-time bonus. And I'm curious, you know, I'm sure there's other stores that are doing the same thing. And, you know, I mean, Fred Meyer is owned by Kroger, which is a huge corporation where their CEOs make more money in a minute than most people probably make in a week even. So it's just kind of scary to see things like that. And I would echo what E said, that, you know, I think it's an experiment of people's lives, and especially those who are increasingly marginalized within this community. So that's really horrifying to see, because they're also probably dealing with some angry and belligerent customers as well, as I've seen in other states. I'm sure there's examples in Oregon too, but I've mainly seen kind of from other states. People discussing like masks and getting in employees' faces and things. So that's really, really scary. So I think we're kind of looking, especially in the Financial Relief Committee at PSU, and how we can kind of work on legislation. So definitely want to keep hearing from OSA and kind of how we can transition, especially as we have new administration will be starting May 31st for us. So myself and E won't be continuing, but other people will hopefully be continuing that work. And I'll still be, engaging with OSA things as well, just not as a ASPSU person. I'm graduating next winter, so I just can't be engaged with that next year. But yeah, just wanted to share that.
Great. Yeah, well, thanks so much for that. And yeah, I think that for those of us that weren't there for the pitch in the last teach-in, even like if you, like folks are saying, like E said and Melon said, if you want to keep getting plugged in, I mean, like we are, right? Like we've got things to do the rest of this term. We got things to do in the summer, got things to do in the fall, right? To like plan and organize around this stuff, the immediate needs, and getting ready for this legislative session that's going to be so huge, right? And everything that's happening now is huge too, right? So just throw it in the chat. Just say like, keep me plugged in. I'm on board. Just throw your email in the chat. We'll like save it, and you will be like added to our list, and we'll keep talking. Awesome. Nick.
Hey, okay. So I want to circle back. Well, first, I just want to say thank you always, OSA. It's always great. I'm like a huge fan of y'all's teach-ins. Thank you, Venus. Always a pleasure as well. I sat on one of the food insecurity listening circles. So I really enjoyed that. And it was a really just cool experience to hear other students on my campus talk about food insecurity and what we can do to address that in the future. I do want to circle back to OERs real quick though. One of my favorite things about OSA is just the ability to connect with other student leaders from across the state and hear about what their concerns are of this time and what they're doing on their campus to support students. And specifically, I wanted to just chat real quick about OER and talk about some of the things that are happening at UO. And hear what may be happening at other campuses, because it sounds like maybe PSU has an OER resolution that, or something like that. But I mean, my background is I come from LCC, kind of like I talked about earlier, and LCC has like one of the best OER programs in the state. And they've kind of been on the forefront of OER, and they have an OER librarian, and they have some funding for their OER program. And in my 3 years that I went there, I probably paid for maybe 10 textbooks total, and that's like across 3 whole years. So that saved me, like I saw like the impact OER can have, and it's thousands of dollars for savings for students. And so I got really into OER advocacy then, and just advocating for them on that campus, and then moving to UO, it was just natural to continue advocating for it there, because they're so far behind LCC, and just textbook costs are just way higher at the public universities and stuff like that. But anyways, so what ASUO has kind of been working on right now is we have an OER librarian, but they are only a 2-year temporary position, and the funding is only temporary through the UO library. So it's not really like a sustainable, like the position hasn't been like sustained and like institutionalized. So like our first natural thing that we're working on is just ensuring that we can keep that OER librarian, because we know how impactful having an OER librarian on campus is to like OER programs. So we are voting on a resolution next week advocating for that position. And then we're just going to continue passing OER related resolutions, and we got an OER task force created out of the provost office, and the student body president-elect ran on textbook affordability, so I'm sure they'll be working on it more. But just like that's kind of what's going on the UO campus, and I'm just curious about, it sounds like PSU has some stuff going on, so I would love to hear from y'all. And I just think it's really important for us to be talking, and hearing what each other's doing is always really awesome. So thank you, OSA, for providing this space for us to do that.
Absolutely. there any other thoughts, questions?
Thank you so much for sharing that link. I will definitely check it out. Cool to hear that there's stuff going on at PSU.
Yeah, I feel like we haven't been able to do a huge amount of mobilization around it just because like we had an academic affairs director before me, and then I only stepped into this position end of winter. So I've honestly just been scrambling and kind of working on other projects as opposed to kind of focusing all of my time on that. But, you know, I think we do have a lot of people kind of continuing on next year. So definitely like feel free to contact us and stay engaged, especially with whoever kind of is appointed to the academic affairs director, because I think that's a good connect with that. And I think we also kind of wanted to acknowledge that it's not even just textbooks. Like my sister, for example, has had several art professors that have said, you need to pick kind of the most expensive art materials, and they've specifically recommended that, which I think is pretty gross in a program that a lot of those people are underrepresented and marginalized students using art as a way to kind of work their way out of that and to kind of talk about their experiences and things. So that's something that's been kind of scary to me to even hear that that's being talked about by professors. So
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll be sure to connect to those folks and talk about what we can all do to collaborate. Thank you. I got to go. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, Nick. And I did want to highlight a few things I saw in the chat. So first of all, someone's like, hey, like, what if, like, is there a way for students to send in stuff beforehand? So that's a great question. So yeah, I think that you should, I'm going to just put my email in the chat. If you want to send comments on the reopening, send them to me and I'll collect them, and I can do two things. I can pass them along to the students that we do have that are able to actually testify, so they can highlight them so that more people's voices can get heard. And then we can also send them along to that committee as supplementary materials also. So did I spell my name right? Yes, I did. So absolutely. So there is that opportunity coming up, and I would love it if people did. And you can share my address around as much as you want to. So it doesn't just have to be people on this. If you have friends that would be interested, just spread it far and wide. I work for you all. So yeah, get me comments and get me thoughts on this reopening, so that that can be passed along to legislators. That'd be great. And then does OSA have an alumni group set up? So we do have a foundation that is like a board of alumni, because we have like a C3 that we do extra fundraising for to try to keep how much like our fees-based thing is, right? But so that's kind of the only alumni thing. And then sometimes we do bye Brenda, thanks for coming. And yeah, sometimes we have like events and stuff for alumni, but we don't have like a super big infrastructure for all of our like student alumni. So if you have thoughts on like things that would be cool to see for that, like, let's talk, let me know. Happy to hear it. Gabby, I see your hand up. What's up? Talk to me.
Yeah, I had a question maybe for E and Madeline, but also for everyone. When I was phone banking for these teach-ins, actually, I was hearing some common stories from graduate students who were experiencing issues around unemployment benefits and receiving unemployment benefits, particularly for their work being halted, and like the potentiality of like if they couldn't continue their research or wouldn't have their positions in the coming future, or have lost their positions right now due to COVID, that they were having issues receiving unemployment because the unemployment office was saying that it didn't count as real work, or it just didn't qualify under the list of conditions. I was wondering if you all have heard anything about that through like the union, or just like through like your channels or anything like that.
I haven't specifically heard anything about that. I've seen kind of articles about what you're talking about, and I've definitely kind of heard that that has been an issue, but I don't really have a real insight as far as PSU and what's being done, because I know especially like scientific labs and things, like I'm sure those things aren't happening at all. whereas research-based work obviously can still maybe continue as far as like writing and things. But yeah, I don't know enough about that, unfortunately.
Yeah, my experience is so I only know of 3 folks who are in the social work program, the graduate program, and have paid positions. They aren't able to work. They gave them some like work initially, like home, like stuff to do from home, but that kind of ran out, and their positions don't really allow them to do really work from home. But the school was still paying them, so they hadn't laid them off. So I don't know if they just didn't have the opportunity yet, but I know our university just laid off like over 1,000 employees. Yeah, a lot of which came from what I hear is from the like child care centers and like daycare centers, because they're not open and we're not able to provide those services. But we're not sure if those positions will come back. One, because we might not even be on campus come fall, but so yeah.
And PSU already had a hiring freeze before this, so that makes me think they won't bring those positions back, to be honest. I think that's a way for them to cut even further back on those, which is disappointing, especially since it's student child care services. And one of the things that director had mentioned was like kind of providing things like, oh, like having your kid like set up somewhere and like kind of talking to the teacher and those kind of remote opportunities. So I thought that sounded like pretty beneficial, and is a bummer that that was scaled back because of those cuts.
Good, thanks for that all. Any other thoughts or questions, folks? Seeing none. Cool.
When's the next one?
The next, so our next teach-in is, that's a great question, E. Thanks for that. Our next teach-in is the same time, 4 to 5:30 next week. We're going to be going over the history of the student movement, and Gabby's going to be putting that on. Gabby's put together a really awesome program for that one that's going to be a little bit different, and I'm stoked on it. So Gabby, you want to describe the next one a little bit for us?
Yes, I do. So what I have been doing in these last 2 weeks is talking with alumni who have been a part of student activism and organizing in a lot of different facets. And we're going to be having a panel. So we're going to look at a history of the student movement, still trying to piece together what that timeline is going to be, but it's going to incorporate things like student fee autonomy, things like the Vietnam War, civil rights, and like the forefront that students were at in a lot of those historical movements. And then we're going to have a panel. And so far I have 4 people kind of semi-confirmed. So we have Lucero, who was a UO alum, and she organized with MECHA and Labor Justice, as well as was a USSA board member. We're going to have Perla Lucio, who's currently the field director for We Count Oregon and is working on census work that's really important for Oregon, and a former legislative director for OSA. We're going to have Andreina Gonado, who is currently an AFSCME organizer at 3299 in Los Angeles, and was also a former UO campus organizer. And then we're going to have Alexandra Flores Quilty, who was also a former chair of the OSA in 2014, I think. So we're gonna have some really great folks from work, people that have done work like from the last few years to last decade, and we're really excited to have a discussion, kind of like a podcast style discussion, where it can be their insights on organizing and the importance of things like coalition building, intersectionality, self-care and community care, and sustainability in movements, as well as working within institutions and also trying to change the institutions and kind of the dynamics that come through that work as well. So I'm really excited to have that panel to you all next Friday at 4 p.m. And feel free to come with some pre-planned questions too. Just think about what you would want to ask organizers that have been a part and down with the movement for quite a while and kind of pick their brain. But yeah, that's what's to come next Friday.
Thanks for that, Gabby. Sounds like you sold Venus. Hopefully you sold other people on it also. I'm so stoked for that. All those folks that are coming, they just do so much cool work. So yeah. Any other kind of final thoughts or questions? Wonderful. Well, once again, Venus, thanks so much for your amazing work. Thanks for making the time to collaborate on this and all of the information and knowledge and wisdom you shared with us. Yeah, thanks. I'm seeing people thank us in the chat. So yeah, everyone, thanks for coming and being part of these. Really appreciate it. And yeah, once again, you're on our email list. You have my email, you have Venus's email. We want to hear from you. We want to work with you on this stuff. So let's be in touch. Let's do it.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrew. And thanks everyone for putting up with me. And please reach out because I'm doing more than just SNAP. I'm doing also working with a nonprofit organization. Actually, I don't know if they're nonprofit. They're called Brink, and they do a lot of storytelling. They've done some work here in Oregon, so I'm really excited about how we can be trained on how we tell our story without it being like, you know, transactional or gross, exploitative, whatever, you know, all those gross things. They're really awesome. So that we were talking a little bit about collecting those stories. So that's important. I want to loop all of us into that.
I love that. Yeah, I want us to all be looped on that too. That's something we've been talking about in OSA a lot over the last year or so too.
Well, we should, I think partners should say you're one of the organizations that we need to train.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Cool. Let's do it.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Have a great weekend.
Yeah, you too. Have
It's
a good
Friday.
weekend. It's Friday.
Yay.
Bye,
Yay.
everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, Venus. That was really helpful.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.